All right, nobility. Nobility consisted of several ranks. They were generally the aristocracy. They, to become a nobleman, of course, you had to be born into it. Now, there were a few exceptions. Kings had the power to raise certain people to noble status. The main thing was you had to own land. You had the duke. He'd be like roughly equivalent to our governor. The count, roughly equivalent to a county sheriff. The viscount, and at the bottom were the barons. These were the people who governed Europe in the absence of strong kings. Eventually they tried to make it sound like they were better than the ordinary people, so the word noble came to mean kind or good or better than the average. Even though if you look at some of the personal lives of some nobility, they were not that much better than ordinary anyway. They had a code of conduct among them known as chivalry. A lot of the code of chivalry had to do with the conduct between men and women. Now, it only applied generally to men and women of a higher rank. But if you were going to cross a stream and it was just a log across a stream and room enough for one person to pass, if there was another man coming at you, the little man better step aside because a bigger man would knock him over. But if it was a woman wanting to pass, it was considered gentlemanly duty for the man to step aside, let the woman cross first. Again, this was the code of chivalry. But if you're walking along a very narrow path, it was considered duty for a man, if he met a woman coming at him, the man should step aside, let the woman stay on the path. Again, this was part of the code of chivalry. It extended into modern times where at one time men would hold the door open for a woman or open a car door. Today, it's looked on as being somewhat outdated. Again, folks, if you don't think so, you're welcome to speak up. I'll say this, I mean, I'm old enough that I was taught when I was a youngster that if I ask a girl out, I should pay. Well, some 28 years or so ago, when I was still single, I asked a woman to go to Stone Mountain. She consented, and when she saw that she had to pay, she started pulling out her money. And hey, keep in mind, she'd been unemployed for 3 months. I'd been working at Lockheed for 7 years. She said, I want to pay my share of this. I said, hey, I knew this was going to cost money when I asked you to come out here. I came prepared to pay. No, she insisted that she pay her part, so we worked, I let her. I went back to Lockheed the following day and discussed with one of my fellow single men and said, yeah, some of my girlfriend do that to me and I don't like it. A lot of the men don't like the idea. Just keep that in mind. I mean, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, because she told me I don't want to get involved in the dating scene. I don't want you to feel like I'm your date. But anyway, making a long story short, I ran into this girl a few years later, and as far as I know, she never married. Of course, I haven't had much contact with her in recent years, but
Let the man
anyway.
be the man.
What's that?
Let the man be the man. Yeah.
Well, that's, yeah, again, if a man wants to pay, ladies, if you want to let him be.
She wants to stay, let her stay.
Well, anyway, I'll be honest with you, I don't like the idea. I don't like the idea, yes.
Wait, because I myself, whenever I'm with one of my friends, the guy friend, like,
Yes, okay.
he'll always want to carry the bag, because I have a son, and he'll like want to carry my son and carry the bag, open the door, and I'm always like, I get everything, and I'll be carrying like 3 bags on me and carrying myself to the car, putting it in the car. And I mean, it's just, I've grown up taking care of myself, like that's how
All right,
society is.
That's the way you feel about it. But, again, some men get the feeling they're being rejected when they do that. I mean, how can you carry a bag? They should let me. Yes.
Yeah, but you can't let all guys pay because they think that you owe them something. So I just pay my half.
Well, that was the logic this woman used with me many years ago. Yeah, that was the logic she used. But again, I want to remind you, some men do not like the idea. All right, anyone else?
I'll tell you, Mr.
Yes.
I'll tell you what. I had a relationship with a a girl for 5 years, since freshman year of high school. I paid for everything. There's nothing for it now. I spent thousands of dollars. And now look, I'm girlfriendless, moneyless. Well, now I have more money because I don't spend on her. Moral of the story is don't buy really expensive stuff for somebody that's... you know what? Because of this experience, I will never gamble again.
Excellent talking. Okay. All right, again, this is getting into personal realm, folk. But I mean, back to the lesson. The code of chivalry came from this. And we would discuss when I was in high school, is chivalry dead? And we go back and forth. Women's lived, the women's movement changed a lot of this stuff. Now, about women, aristocratic women could own property. And folk, in all my 14 years of teaching, I've taught this class about 30 times, no one has ever written a paper about Eleanor of Aquitaine. And I don't quite know why, because there's not that many women to write about in this course, because most of those mostly men. But nevertheless, Eleanor of Aquitaine got to be Duchess when her father, who was the Duke of Aquitaine, died quite young, and Eleanor was still a child when all of a sudden her father's title of Duke fell on her. And she lived to be in her 80s, so she was Duchess of Aquitaine as long as she lived. And in other words, Aquitaine was one of the biggest domains in France. All right, I'm going to go into more detail about it. Your book does. Eleanor married the King of France, King Louis VII, and of course this greatly increased the king's domains. I mean, to get her. Now, he wound up losing it all. I mean, losing her domain because she divorced him. Anyway, the king, Louis VII, had started off as a monk. He was the second son of his father, Louis VI. And his father said, now, I want all my crown and throne to go to your older brother. You become a monk. Then all of a sudden, the older brother died. So they called Louis VII out of a monastery and put him in line for the king. When his father died, he became king. But the problem was Eleanor didn't like it. I thought I married a king, and here I married a monk. He was still practicing a lot of his monkish ways in spite of now having the title of king. But another problem she had, she only bore female children. And she was supposed to bear the king a male heir. Now today, from what we know about this subject, we know the male has everything to do with whether or not the offspring is a boy or a girl or male or female. It's all up to the male. But in those days, if a woman did not bear a male child, it was going to be her fault. And men would try to marry women who had a lot of brothers, thinking that a woman with a lot of brothers would be more likely to produce a male heir, which is not the case. Now, as far as Eleanor, it's ironic. Once Louis VII divorced Eleanor, Eleanor married Henry II, King of England, and she bore Henry 4 sons. In addition to all the girl children she already had by Louis. Anyway, when Louis VII decided to go on a crusade, Eleanor collected 50 women, and they went with him on the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade was a flop, and it might have been partly because these women were wrong. And basically what you had was 50 women, some of them high-born, including Eleanor, going on a crusade with thousands of men. And folk, I don't know how to say it nicely, but these women were passed around among the men, including Eleanor herself. And your book goes so far as to mention that her husband finally divorced her after she'd had an alleged affair with her uncle. But actually, if you go into more detail, she had alleged affairs with several men on the crusade. But finally, he divorced her on grounds of not bearing a male heir and also adultery. And once she had divorced, she soon after married Henry, who became Henry II of England. As I mentioned, bore him 4 children. 2 of them became kings, King Richard and King John. She lived to be an old woman, and she oftentimes helped her sons rebel against her father Henry. She and Henry did not get along, and Henry wound up putting her in prison for a while. There has been movies made about these incidents, and your book mentions one made in 1968, Lion and Winter, which I did not see, about how the family of Henry II, it was a dysfunctional family. They called him, Henry II, the faithless father of a faithless brood. His wife was unfaithful to him. His sons were disloyal to him. Very dysfunctional family, the royal family was those days. Now, I want to elaborate a little bit farther on Eleanor. Some people say that Eleanor was the inventor of romance. No, in those days, marriages were not based on romance so much as they were necessity. But beginning with Eleanor, Eleanor taught the people of her day to follow your emotions. Now, folks, don't think I'm teaching this. I'm teaching what I don't believe. All right. Follow your emotions. Let your emotions guide you. And when you love someone, love until the feeling goes. And once the feeling goes, it's never going to come back. Leave that person for someone else. This scenario was followed by a lot of the nobility around Paris and the rest of France for many, many generations. And it's believed that this same idea has found its way to the Hollywood scene, where 90% of your Hollywood actors and actresses trade partners fairly often. Now, some of them don't. I mean, Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, name a few. Pat Boone, a few who never had a one marriage partner in their lifetime. But it's rare. Some of you might name a few others. I'm not talking about Elizabeth Taylor or Jane Fonda, I mean, obviously. But if they follow where their feelings lead, and when their feeling goes, they go too. They go with it. And again, some of the same ideas have been traced back to Eleanor, who has been called the father of this kind of. All right. I've already mentioned trade. There was very little money in those days in circulation. So oftentimes the trade was by barter. Your book doesn't mention this, so you don't have to write it down. I'm not going to ask when I tell you. Barter is basically where you trade an item for another item. Now, all of you have probably done that some when you were in elementary school. A lot of elementary and high school students will do this. Trade my item for yours. Even trade on an international level is sometimes a barter. But don't try to go to a department store and trade by barter. They won't take your product. But anyway, they didn't have a whole lot of money, and Europe was to be deprived of a lot of gold and silver coins until the Spanish brought in gold and silver from the New World many, many years later. Eventually they started trading among themselves, one community with another. Then they started trading with outsiders, trading with the Scandinavians, or trading across the Mediterranean, trading even with the Muslims living in regions of North Africa. It is believed a lot of the iron that was used for the armor the Knights wore was initially mined in Africa. Now, while I'm on the subject of knights, the knight was the mounted cavalryman of the Middle Ages. There have been many, many stories of knights in their shining armor. On a battlefield, for 500 years, knights dominated a battlefield, and knights were seldom killed on a battlefield. The knight had a lot of armor to protect him, but now armored knights went out of style with the invention of the cannon and the rifle later. And armor just wasn't enough to protect them. Anyway, the word knight means mounted horseman. The invention of the stirrup helped the knight get on his horse, and also they learned how to breed bigger and better horses, but I think something else went on too. The European male became smaller and lighter, not owing to bad diet, but owing to inbreeding. That's the best way I can say it. Inbreeding in the European male. It's known from the armor that average height of the European knight, based on the size of armor, is about 4'6". Now, folk, you seldom see a man who's 4'6" in America today. But the average male was about 4'6", and a lot of that might have been due to inbreeding. The knights only married among other knights, and the serfs only married serfs. And the result was the men became smaller and smaller in size. But they were able to breed better horses, and eventually even put armor on their horses. To become a knight, you had to be of noble birth. I mean, to afford those horses and armor and stirrups and the spears to use, all that cost a lot of money. At 6, you become a page boy, running errands for your local nobleman or running errands for the king. At 14, you become a squire. The squire was the person who assisted the knight. And attended to the knight's personal needs as much as he could. Then at 21, you would wind up going through a ceremony where you'd pray all night and then promise with a big strong oath to follow the king or your Lord wherever he went, even to the ends of the earth, and fight God's battles and protect the weak and protect the women, and you'd become a knight. Now, there was one, I'm going to say bad side to knighthood. The knight was expected to have a lady, and no, the lady was not his wife. That was strictly forbidden. I mean, he didn't have a wife, but he had a lady for whom he was her champion. He'd fight her battles for her. The most famous case of this is Sir Lancelot was the champion of Queen Guinevere. But anyway, he was expected to fight her battles, and many a knight lost his life because this lady over here would get her knight to fight against this lady over here with her knight. So it was the two knights were expected to fight it out for two different ladies, and oftentimes one of the knights would be killed or badly wounded in the fight. And also, much too often, the relationship between the knight and his lady was supposed to be platonic. Much too often it degenerated into adultery, as was in the case with Lancelot and Guinevere. And this eventually made the practice, the practice eventually fell out of existence. Castles, a big part of the medieval scene. No two castles were alike. Just like the Lord's domain, no two were alike. But oftentimes castles were surrounded by a body of water called a moat. They had places where dungeons like where prisoners were kept, were also tunnels where the Lord and Lady could escape, the location of which was kept secret from most people, but the Lord and Lady could escape if war came. They did have the catapult. Taking another nobleman's castle was a big part of a game that, you know, I say the Middle Ages nobles played. In other words, if I'm stronger than you, if I go to war, I'm going to take your castle. And they invented a catapult to where they could hurl large stones over the castle walls, and hopefully that would, sometimes they'd also shoot flaming arrows in the castle walls in hopes that would set the castle on fire. You might ask, weren't the castles made of stone? Not all of them. But also, even a stone castle would have a whole lot of straw and debris on the floor and animal waste and whatever on the floor that would dry out and could make for a pretty bad fire when they were hit by flames. So the people inside feared the flaming arrows.